And today we have Thomas Jefferson, one of his favorite architects. Next week I'm not going to go through all of them, but next week, Henry Hobson Richardson. How many of you heard of Richardson? A few, yeah. One of the most interesting original American architects. So I won't say anything further to present Henry Matthews.
How many of you knew that Thomas Jefferson was a passionate architect? So no, this isn't widely known, but that was his passion. He put up with being president. So just a few details to begin with. He was born in 1743. His father was a wealthy landowner who made quite a lot of money and left Jefferson what he needed to build himself a house that I'm sure cost a lot of money, and to buy a lot of slaves. He attended William and Mary College, and then he studied law. In 1775, he was elected to the Continental Congress, and then, as you all know, he was the principal writer of the Declaration of Independence. And I think when you see that of all those people, he was the one to write it. He was just known to be wise and literate. He was one of the most educated men in America. He was passionate about music and literature, had a huge library, which he eventually donated to the Library of Congress. I think he was short of money, so he sold it. In 1779, he was made governor of Virginia. Shortly after that, after his wife died, he went to Paris and he took Sally Hemings and his older brother, as two slaves. But once they were in France, where there was no slavery, they were free people. Once they got home again, they were slaves, but for reasons you probably know, Sally Hemings was treated better than some slaves. So he became ambassador to France. I think he was called chief minister to France. And while he was in France, he traveled to the south of France and to northern Italy, and saw quite a lot of architecture, which he enjoyed more than his political life. So here he is writing admiring the Declaration of Independence. He is the one in the middle of the group with a red vest on. This is the original building of William and Mary College where he studied, and he had a very poor opinion of this architecture. He complained that there was no real architecture in America. I've got some quotes here. In a thing that he wrote entitled Notes on Virginia, he wrote, "The first principles of art are unknown, and it's scarcely, and there is scarcely a model that gives us any idea of it. The private buildings here are rarely constructed of brick or stone, being constructed of scantling and boards plastered with lime. It's impossible to devise anything more ugly, more uncomfortable, or, happily, more perishable." But when he was in Europe, he somewhat despised European luxury and the over-refinement and the unnecessary elaboration of buildings. What he really admired was the architecture of Andrea Palladio. He didn't go to Vicenza when he was in Europe, but he had a copy of Palladio's 4 books of architecture. There were 2 copies in the United States. Most architects worked from pattern books. There was little architectural training, but there were books, various books, one of them by James Gibbs, the British architect, from which they could give instructions to carpenters as to what to do. But Jefferson had the real thing, the 4 books of architecture by Palladio. My copy is not leather bound by his, but like his, but here it is, and you can take a look at it afterwards. And it showed Palladio's own works, and certainly Jefferson was familiar with the most famous of all, the Villa Rotunda at Vicenza, which had classical porticos on all 4 sides and a central dome. And we'll see later how much he had admired this building form. But there was something about Jefferson's architecture that was particularly fascinating to Jefferson, and something that he adapted for his own house. In this particular villa, you'll see that there is a grand house in the middle, and then there are wings connected with arcades, with arches. And behind these arches are not more grand rooms, but barns and stables and shops for agricultural machinery and so on. The wealthy people of Venice escaped the stink of the canals in the summer and moved out into the Veneto around Vicenza, and the architect Palladio built houses for many of them, and these were what gave Jefferson his idea. But we will see that he treats the dependencies in a different way. Here's one villa, I'm not sure its name, with wings on either side, enclosing a formal courtyard. And when I drive through the Washington countryside and see farms, I sometimes think, why didn't they follow Palladio? There's a farmhouse here, and there's barns and sheds scattered around promiscuously in the landscape with no sense of what's right in architecture. So Jefferson's first design for Monticello was quite different from what he actually built. That was before he went to Europe. He did do architectural drawings himself. I could have included a lot of drawings for the buildings we're going to see, but I think this is one of a few. But this is different from the finished building. When he was in Paris, he fell in love with a house that was going up, the Hôtel de Salm. Hôtel being the French word for townhouse. It's right next to the Gare, which is the one which is a museum. The Gare, never mind. The one which is a museum. So when you go to that museum, you can see the house. Yes. Sorry, Will. The Musée d'Orsay, of course, that was the Gare d'Orsay. And right next to that is the Hôtel de Salm. And he loved the dome. Something that interested him was the fact that there were 2 stories in the front and 1 story in the back, though he didn't follow that idea, but he did exaggerate the dome on this one, as you will see in the next picture. This drawing of Monticello was drawn by John Mills, who became a famous American architect, but he actually came to live at Monticello to be instructed in the art of architecture by Jefferson. And so Jefferson had him do drawings of Monticello. This is pretty much the way that it was built. Here you will see that the dependencies are a little further from the building on either side. They turned at angles, enclosing what you might think is a courtyard, but it's not. They were sunk below the top of the hill, and there were terraces on their roofs. In the next picture, you can see those terraces only standing a little above the top of the hill, and on either side are two little buildings, one of which was Jefferson's law office, and the other is called the honeymoon cottage, because when he arrived with his wife Martha in the middle of a snowstorm, having abandoned the carriage and slogged through the snow, expecting to find a fire burning in this one small building, nothing was heating it up, so he had a very cold night. But this is the way we see it, with the dependencies sunk below the top of the hill. He was not slavishly following Palladio. He had a better idea. So from his library on the facade that you see there, he could walk out onto this terrace and look out on the hills of his beloved Virginia. We have a plan here, which I can... No, well, where's the pointer? I may need it sometime. I thought it was... Oh, it's here, yes. Okay. So here is the classical portico that you see. Actually, this is from the back. This is the portico that you can see. And here is the entrance hall, from which doors lead into the drawing room beyond, where he had a huge collection of pictures. And then this was his own bedroom. And his bed was situated in the wall there. So this was his study, where he did his architectural drawings, and this was his library. And then there was a sort of glass house here, looking at a room with large windows that looked out on the terrace. And then there were other rooms around. But what do you expect to see in a grand mansion when you enter? A fine staircase. Jefferson said, why waste space on a staircase? So he had a staircase here and a staircase here, which was very practical. So this was the facade of Jefferson, with the door opening from the drawing room, and you will see that the windows are rather tall and thin, which was something that he borrowed from the Hotel de Salm, and he had the dome like the Hotel de Salm, but he wasn't going to miss the pediment because he loved classical architecture, so that dominates. Here is the entrance hall, looking rather tidy. After the Lewis and Clark expedition returned, he asked for some of the things that they had brought with them, and there were various interesting items. I'm not sure how many of them are there now. Now you'll notice that over here there's a door which is slightly open, and he arranged it so that if you opened one door, the second one would open, because under the floor he had a chain and a couple of pulleys that would operate that. he loved anything that he loved inventing things that solved little problems, even if he only imagined the problems. And here's a friend of ours taking a look later on, and it seems that they've installed some interesting things that might have been brought back by Lewis and Clark on the wall, as well as a bear skin that wasn't in the other picture. There he is with President Hollande of France. And then up above is the dome room. I'm not sure how he used that room, but I can imagine that he loved going up there and looking out at through the windows in several different directions at his beloved Virginia countryside. Now, there was very little art in the colony, and Jefferson arrived back from Paris with 80 crates of furniture and pictures. So he was ready to furnish this house, though for a long time he lived in Washington and Monticello was not built. But this is some of his art collection. And then this is the dining room, which you can see has an exit onto the terrace outside. And one particularly interesting invention in the side of the fireplace is a dumbwaiter. And this one went down to the wine cellar below. So he could sort of bang 3 times on the ceiling and they'd bring red wine, or twice they'd bring white, or I'm not quite sure. But anyway, it was very well arranged. And then there was a door here which swiveled, and there were trays on the other side of the door on which plates of food could be placed, so that the servants didn't have to come into the room to wait on him. If they were having a very private conversation, the food would be delivered that way. Here's a small bedroom, and then this is Jefferson's bedroom, in which the bed was in the wall between 2 halves of the room, and there was a little staircase in that going up to where he kept his clothes. But he could go to bed in the bedroom side and then wake up in the middle of the night having an architectural idea, and he could climb out of bed, and he had a table over here. That's actually a music stand that he designed, but there was also a drawing board of his design, and he could do architectural drawings in the middle of the night. And there's the view out onto the terrace and beyond. It's so he's taken the idea of Palladio and used it to please himself. He wasn't a slavish copier. So on the next slide, we see the view from the gardens below. The house is on top of the hill. The terraces are raised up from the side of the hill, and there are lots of little doors that lead into important places. Where are we? The small building is the honeymoon cottage, or it's the law office. I don't remember for sure which was which. So they were at the ends of the terraces, and they both had fireplaces, though in the honeymoon cottage on the right here, the fire had not been lit, and he and Martha froze. Then below, the rest are such places as stables and an ice house. How could you cool your mint juleps if you hadn't collected ice in the winter probably from far away, since this was Virginia, and stored it under a lot of straw to keep it cool. And then here is the kitchen, at least as you see it, got ready for the tourists. And then lower down the hill were terraced gardens. He was a passionate gardener. When he was in Europe, he traveled around England with a guide who showed him some of the most beautiful romantic gardens. You know, the French had formal gardens in geometric patterns, and then such as at Versailles, but the English tried to make the gardens much more natural. And you know that there's an English garden at Versailles. It's a little way to get to it, because they had to keep their formal geometric pattern. But then they built a little dairy where they had fake milkmaids masquerading and an informal garden around it. So there is a view across his garden at the hills beyond. So that is Monticello, his first work, and one that he built with a great deal of passion. After he returned to Monticello, he pulled most of it down and started again. But yes. And then just near Monticello is this natural arch, which apparently he purchased from King George III. What the king was doing there, I don't know, but Susan and I went there once on our way through Virginia, and so I remember this place very well. Well, Jefferson, when he was in France, made a trip to the south, and he went to the city of Nîmes, where there was a Roman temple known as the Maison Carrée. I don't know why they called it a square house, but that's what they called it. And in the distance, you can see a little bit of the theatre and some monument on the right. And Jefferson was absolutely obsessed by this. He wrote to an aristocratic French lady he was communicating with. I don't know what else he was doing in her company, but he wrote to her. There may be a clue in what he wrote. He said, "Madam, I gazed at this temple as a lover gazes upon his mistress." So he didn't just look, he made decisions. He decided that this was the ideal building form for the capital of his state of Virginia. And so he had a model made of it, which he sent ahead of himself and said, "This is how I want the Capitol built." And he had been governor of Virginia, so I suppose he had a bit of clout there. And amazingly, they did it. But of course, it turned out to be a bit small, and so they added wings on either side. Here is the interior, a formal space with in the center a statue of George Washington by the French sculptor Houdon, Houdon, and he did bring some other sculpture by Houdon to the States. At this stage, there was a competition for the design of the president's house, and he entered the competition anonymously. So this is his design for the president's house. Have we seen something like this before? You remember how I admired him for altering Palladio's design to be more practical for his site and his servants' quarters? But this was his idea for the president's house, and it did not win the competition. Well, then he personally designed the University of Virginia. Here's an aerial view of it, obviously done later in the middle of a book that's slightly creased, but you can see the idea that there's a huge replica of the Pantheon at one end, and then a lot of little what he called pavilions. He said he did not want to build one grand building that contained everyone and everything, all the purposes of the university, but he wanted to have a series of houses for the professors. Each professor would have a house with his own accommodation and classrooms, and then there would be rooms for the students. And we will see, I don't go inside one, but I can show you how they are arranged. Well, he may have got this idea in France from the Chateau de Marly, built by Louis XIV in the late 17th century. Louis built it because sometimes he wanted to get away from the crowds of people at Versailles. There were stables for 1,000 horses at Versailles, and that gives you an idea how many people there were. And so having a grand house at the end of wait a minute. This is the one. This is the one I want. A house for the king at the end of an axis with a beautiful pool, then a series of little pavilions, as he described them. So he had room for 12 families if he wanted to get away from too much company, and they were arranged in this formal way. And I think that, as has been pointed out, this might have been a model for him, because at the University of Virginia, he placed the library at the head of what is called the lawn, and then there are pavilions on either side, the professors' houses linked by arcades. So this is inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, which he had not seen but he knew about, by Palladio, and ideas that he got from books. But he came up with a completely original idea. He described it as an academical village. And I was very happy when I visited, it must be some years ago, because this little shack here has scrawled on it, Free Nelson Mandela, and the University of Virginia was investing some of their funds in South Africa, so it says divest now. Well, time has moved on, and they did. So here is this magnificent library. I never went into it, but I could have shown plans. It's very odd. The upper level is a huge round room with an opening in the middle. You can lean over a balustrade and look down on the space. Oh no, that's not true. You can. There are columns around it, and you can look up, and there's a walkway around up above. But down below, he had 3 oval rooms, which I think was a little bit crazy, but I admire him in most ways, but I have doubts about that. So here's this grand pediment with Corinthian columns on the library, and when you look beyond the library, you see the first of the many pavilions that provided houses for the professors, and in the links between them I think I was talking about the next picture. It's this one. So here's one of the professors' houses with classrooms below and the accommodation for the professor above, who had a roof garden above the linking structures. So here's a view across the lawn. You see several of those pavilions, and each one is different. Why? Because this was an architectural textbook. There was no School of Architecture, I suppose, at the university, but it was a school for clients, a school for people who would grow wealthy and build buildings that would pass muster with Jefferson's judgment. And they were based on buildings that he knew. One of them was a temple in Rome. Several of them were country villas in Italy that he'd found pictures of. I really wanted to find all the pavilions and identify them according to what this inspired them, and I didn't quite manage to do that. Never mind, it was a sort of architectural textbook for wealthy Virginians who would be patrons of architecture. So here's a view down the colonnade that links all the buildings. Very practical. If it's raining, you can walk from one part of the university to another under cover. And then, I do this wrong. Here's the entrance to one of the areas with 2 classrooms for the professor, and then you see doors leading into the students' rooms. I think I'll go. You might not be able to make out, but in the deep shadow are stacks of wood. And when I went to the university many years ago, I think I've been twice, I did look into one room, and I saw that they had a fireplace in it, and they had to heat their rooms that way. Maybe they still do it that way. So each of these is an exemplar that a student could follow for how he or she would build a house in the future. They could be a colonnade above and a row of arches, or they could be taller columns. And each one is identified by what inspired Jefferson to build it. You notice that there's an even difference of colors, that this one has a brick upper story. There are a couple like that. And then the backs were of brick. And they were raised up above gardens, which were separated. Oh, I keep looking at the next picture and talking about it. Sorry. Here are the backs built of red brick, raised up above gardens, and the gardens were separated by these walls. So I could go back and talk a little bit about some of his experience and thoughts. Talking about Virginia, maybe I read this one before. The private buildings are rarely constructed of brick or stone. Did I? I did read that. The Marquis de Chastellux, who came and saw Monticello, was delighted with it, and he said that Jefferson was the first American who has consulted the fine arts on how to know how he should defend himself, shelter himself from the weather. I like that. Jefferson said the first principles of art are unknown, and there's scarcely a model here to give us an idea of architectural principles. So, well, I think we could discuss a bit more. Do any of you have any questions? Yes, Bob.
I noticed in the university designs that the oval crops up a lot, and that seemed to be like a new form. Is that sort of just something to make it a little different, or did it have a particular meaning?
Well, yeah, I intended to put in more architectural drawings. I kind of ran out of time. And there was an interior of the library at the university. The ground floor had three ovals and a strange shaped space between them downstairs. A little bit awkward, I think, but he seemed to like ovals. Grant.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Monticello has always seemed to me to be have a few rough edges. The porch that whose ceiling rises above to make room for a window that obviously wasn't entirely thought through, and that half oculus over the front porch seems not quite the Dome of Florence. I thought at Monticello, yes, you can see here the rising ceiling in the portico. I've often thought that he was learning at Monticello, and then when he gets to the university, it's perfect. The university, the entire scheme, you've described it beautifully, really is quite a creation, I think, that has lasted over time. The University of Washington, when Bebb and Gould were planning it, drew on the centrality of the library for their design, and the fact that Suzzallo is the prominent feature is a direct homage to Jefferson's Virginia.
Thank you, yes. Yes.
Wait. Was Jefferson left-handed?
Or you?
Was Jefferson left-handed?
Well, I don't know. Does anyone know that?
Why do you ask?
I ask because several studies, especially two that were conducted at the University of Cincinnati, have shown that 50% of architects are left-handed.
Well,
I wondered about the same
how
thing
many
about
architects
Palladio.
are there in this room?
Does that mean
Jen-
my brain?
Pardon?
Are you an architect? Yes.
Yeah, Jane.
Are you left-handed? No, I'm not.
Jane and Grant. I didn't know you were an architect. You're everything.
There are
Oh.
there are a
You're left.
there are a number of left-handed architects, and I have to tell you, when I was a student, one of the left-handed architects said to me, we'd go to the local coffee shop, and he said how lucky he was to be left-handed, and because what was it, 80% are right-handed, and so he only had 20% or 15%. chance of catching germs off of dirty cups, okay, because he was left-handed. Well, I took up drinking coffee at the university left-handed, partly because of that, and partly because as a child I was in the YMCA, and the YMCA director said he had all this strength. He was a diver and a gymnast, but he didn't have any use of his hands, so he took up juggling. He said, why do you have all these muscles and this dead thing on the end that doesn't do anything? And so I started drinking coffee left-handed. So when I went to Europe, for a couple of years, I could eat left-handed. I could do all kinds of things left-handed, all because of drinking coffee left-handed, because a left-handed architect told me that's the way to stay healthy.
Well, thank you, Jane. Maybe it's a little late to change now.
I just looked it up, and he's not listed as a left-handed president. However, Virginia is very important in my family because my parents lived there. Mother went to the College of William and Mary, and they created me there, and that's my middle name.
Ah,
All right. Left-handed question. You have a different one.
Just to add one more point about this discussion, just last night, I was talking with someone who works at the reception desk at Horizon House, and I noticed that she was writing something left-handed. And she happened to mention that she was interested in architecture, but she was studying something else at the university. But she had a great interest in architecture.
Wow, that's fascinating. Left-handed architects.
Yes, I'm wondering about the pavilions and if they're still being used, and if so, what are they used for? This is at the university.
well, there were certainly students living behind the columns between the pavilions, and I presume that the pavilions are houses for faculty. Has anyone been there?
I've been there. I've seen people all around.
Yeah. There are definitely classrooms below, and I would imagine that there's a very strong sense of tradition at the University of Virginia. Why would this accommodation for faculty is not suitable for large families, but I'm sure there's prized living places for faculty grant.
Any more? Did you have a question?
Just one.
There's somebody else over here.
Left-handed business.
Wait.
I've known a lot of architects and hundreds of students, and now I have a microphone. I've known a lot. I can only recall two out of all that large number that I was sure were left-handed. One was Dan Streisguth, and the other was a student whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten. But I didn't notice a particular preponderance, but the numbers I think are secure. There is a larger number of left-handed people in that field than in the general population. I'm not sure it's a very large difference, but there is a difference.
Fascinating. I have a question. These are beautifully crafted capitals. How did he find people to do that kind of work, since he seems to have been the first one to do it?
That's a very good question. When I know he persuaded Houdon, the sculptor, to come to the United States, and he rustled up commissions for him. Various other people, other than George Washington, wanted statues by Houdon, and Houdon stayed for a while. And I think he went back and carved the statues. But probably Jefferson would have solicited craftsmen. I have not read that anywhere.
But especially the Corinthian columns that are very beautifully done with the leaves.
Yes.
It seemed like somebody really knew what they were doing.
But
These are more straightforward. But
think of an American architect. I did a tour of the South one day and looked at a lot of antebellum houses and postbellum too, I suppose. And the Americans I think with the result, as a result of Jefferson's urging, Americans really wanted to build beautiful houses, and craftsmen flocked here in order to construct them.
Maybe that's it.
Yes.
Sam.
Henry, I love Jeffersonian architecture and am much less enthused than about architecture today. What was Jefferson's influence coming down the decades and the centuries on American architecture?
Well, after the Jefferson's era, and if I'd known that I'd finished so early, I would have thrown in Bullfinch too, who was a successful architect who designed the Massachusetts state capitol. And so wait a minute, what was the question?
How influential was he over the decades? You know, like later.
But after this era came the Greek Revival. The Greek Revival was more highly developed in the United States than any European country. There was a Greek Revival in England, and there were country houses that were authentically Greek. And British architects went and did measured drawings of the buildings of the Acropolis in Athens and published them. And I was born at a college where my father taught, which was designed by the architect who designed the National Gallery in London. If you imagine yourself in Trafalgar Square and look north to the National Gallery, very correct ionic columns. So there were fine examples of the Greek Revival in England, but it became absolutely the only style unless it was Gothic. Churches tended to be built in the Gothic Revival style. Some houses, there are some amazing houses, all pinnacles and buttresses and so on. So Palladian classicism sort of tended to disappear, and then after the Greek Revival came quite a change when buildings became more flamboyant. The Greek Revival was very pure, and then classicism could take on a certain vulgarity later on.
So are you
and
going to be
everyone was
talking
trying
about?
to show their wealth.
Are you going to talk about vulgarity later on?
I'll try.
So this is based on Palladio, who's Renaissance,
Yes,
and then they went back to the Greeks. Is that it?
yes.
Okay, and then we went forward to Gothic, and that's an interesting chronology.
Well, the Greek Revival and the Gothic Revival came at the same time. It was an era of historicism, where that was followed by an era of grand inventions. How would you describe it, Grant?
Yeah, we have to remember too that the first steam engine was 1699, years before University of Virginia and Jefferson, and that, of course, reshaped the world. By 1850, not all that long after Virginia, we began to have the earliest stages of the elevator, and that led to tall buildings and another story entirely. So the stylistic realm or era of architecture began to be overlaid by a mechanistically driven realm, I suppose I would say, and that the story then alters. I would have said, and perhaps you could correct me, Henry, I would have said that for all of Jefferson's enormous significance in his little world, he had relatively little influence, would you have said, or not?
I think I think he had his influence on the idea of the importance of architecture. But well, you know, there were quite a lot of Palladian houses, not villa rotundas, but following various other Palladian aspects.
Well, Jefferson represents a agricultural America, and what you're describing is by 1850 and even before, that era ending. And so even I think of the University of Virginia, which is absolutely beautiful. I've been there several times. How did it function? And you realize it's built around gardens. What were they teaching? Probably agricultural techniques. I don't know. They don't seem to be anything like what a university looks like now or feels like, and their tall buildings is pointed
But weren't
out.
they teaching Greek and Latin?
They were teaching that. It's true, Greek and Latin, but obviously he was an agriculturalist. The gardens that you noticed was attached to all of the
Backs of the
houses.
pavilion.
You know, they were not the gardens that we think of today, the flowers and everything. They were planting food to eat, and so I don't know if that was part of the curriculum, but it would seem to me for a man who envisioned the United States as an agricultural country, with everyone being the yeoman farmer being the purest citizen.
That's a very good point. I'm very glad you brought that up. And of course, Jefferson's estate was immensely productive, but he also manufactured nails. The young slave boys were put to work making nails, and he sold a lot of those. And I think he also had a spinning mill where a lot of the women worked.
What happened, I think, at the University of Virginia, as what happened in Oxford and Cambridge and the other, were built on this little, each professor had a little place they saw students. It was the rise of science, and you couldn't do that. And so what happened in these universities, big science buildings were built. They're separate from what was going on in the colleges, where certain things were still taught. And that's what happened, I believe, at the University of Virginia as well.
That's a very good point. Yeah. But a young new faculty member could arrive to teach physics or something like that, and he would be offered a place to live on the lawn, which would make him feel good. Or
Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.